my straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake, I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
There are a lot of pressing issues in the United States today. Maybe you felt the inspiration to take on one of these challenges yourself by volunteering, starting a business, or doing some community organizing. But if you've ever done any work to serve the community, you may have been confronted with a number of issues. If you volunteer at a soup kitchen, a free clinic, or the like, you may feel overwhelmed by the amount of people in need and the lack of resources to support them. If you're a young political activist who wants to garner support for a cause that's important to you, you may feel disillusioned by your ability to compete with massive corporate donors and the suits and smoky back rooms. If you're an entrepreneur who wants to leverage the power of the private sector to bring needed goods and services to your community, you may struggle with bureaucratic red tape or having to compete with the Amazons and Walmarts of the world. After a while, despite your best efforts and good intentions, you may end up asking yourself a question. Can I really make a difference? Is this time and effort worth it? And there's a very simple explanation for why you may feel that way. The United States and its problems are too big for any one person to take on, and that's by design. It wasn't always like this. In fact, you'd only have to go back 170 years, or 1.7 Betty Whites, to 1850 to see that for roughly 90% of Americans, life was centered around mostly small communities. Shops were owned and operated by mom and pops, and the food you ate was likely grown locally. People knew and worked for one another. This created a sense of belonging and identity among the residents of these communities. But then in the second half of the 19th century, everything changed. The American Industrial Revolution erupted, bringing with it the means for mass production of goods and services. In 1856, Henry Bessemer discovered that by blowing air through molten iron ore, it would remove its impurities and thus allow the mass production of steel, making steel cheaper than ever. Since steel was stronger and lighter than ore, this influx helped us build railroads, factories, buildings, and bridges faster and cheaper than ever before. The infrastructure for larger and more populous cities was thus made possible for the first time. Then, in 1878, Alexander Graham Bell patented the use of telegraphy in a way that could transmit speech, and so the telephone was born. It would only be a couple years later when in 1880 Thomas Edison would patent the incandescent light bulb. 45 years later, more than half of Americans would use electric lighting within their homes. Now with electricity, an explosion of cheap, resilient infrastructure, and a revolution in telecommunications, urban economies begin to boom. Companies in the steel, railroad, energy, and banking sectors begin to make oodles of money, supplying the foundations for this new American economy. They eventually settle and concentrate in economic centers to facilitate trade, business administration, law, and public policy. This concentration of economic activity naturally requires workers to fill out the rank and file of industry. And with a growing population, naturally comes the need for doctors, educators, nannies, grocery clerks, and every other job you can think of. With this surge of new economic opportunity, people flood out of their small communities across America to come and try to make it in the big city. The notions of a little kid in a big city even becomes a common American trope in media. And in so many words, this is how America shifted in less than 200 years from a nation of scattered, small communities to a nation of concentrated wealth and metropolitan population centers. This centralization of money and power has disproportionately benefited and empowered the heads of these large institutions established around this time, which continue into our modern day. Growth of the private sector not only drove the concentration of wealth in places like New York City, but it also drove the concentration of political power in these areas as well. More people with more money create larger tax bases, and suddenly, city, state, and federal governments are flush with cash. These growing public and private sectors naturally reinforce one another. Business executives hope to use their newfound wealth to secure propitious industry regulations, and there's no shortage of politicians willing to lend a hand. or two. One of the most famous examples of political corruption during this era was William Boss Tweed, who in 1858 used his considerable political connections to get appointed to the New York County Board of Supervisors. Once on the board, he would charge vendors that negotiated with him a 15% overage on all deals made with the city. After securing a deal, he and his cronies would use the 15% difference to buy off other board members who would have otherwise opposed these corrupt bargains, and then they pocketed the remainder. Sometime later, Tweed had a friend, Judge George G. Bernard, certify him as a lawyer despite having no formal training. He then used this status as an attorney to create new revenue streams for himself by extorting money disguised as legal services. Tweed would later translate his government background and prodigious criminality into a seat as a state senator, as well as becoming one of the largest landowners in New York City. And I'd really like this point to sink in. Tweed became one of the most powerful and wealthy people in what is one of the most powerful and wealthy cities in the world, and he did it through crime. We know he did. It is a matter of historical fact. I don't want to dwell on this point too much, but consider all the people you know in life who are law-abiding citizens, work extremely hard, and are paid hardly anything at all for it. Now consider Tweed, who made all his money by ripping off small entrepreneurs while sitting around smoking cigars with his political cronies. This abuse of concentrated political and economic power, rather than hard work, is how modern wealth in America was actually built. Now, while industry and cities and crime and corruption were all getting bigger and better than ever, the US was also rapidly expanding westward, under a project it was calling Extermination of the Natives. Oh, wait, no. I'm sorry? Okay, I'm told it was called Manifest Destiny. All this is to say that during the late 19th century, the US was getting bigger, both geographically, economically, and as a political power. For the private sector, more land and more people meant more labor, more scale, bigger businesses, and fatter profits. For the government, it means bigger armies, larger tax bases, and more influence over an expanded domain. And here's when we get to the point of what this video, as well as the last 2 centuries of American history, have been about. Hegemony. Dominance of the social hierarchy. More money and more control over more people on a larger and larger scale. It's all about sitting at the top of the social pyramid to get to feel like Big Daddy's biggest boy. Fast forward to today, and this trend towards centralized control of the economy by a handful of powerful actors has only accelerated. With the advent of television and the internet, members of the ruling class have been able to deepen their control over public discourse while broadening their economic dominance to a global scale. One can make connections with political and business leaders around the world, combine forces to create massive mergers, and open operations in places with exploitable labor pools and corruptible governments. You can pay people halfway across the globe to make more stuff for less money, and you probably don't even need to deal with pollution or deadly working conditions. And that, in so many words, brings us up to the globalized and corporate-run modern era. So what does this mean for you? You know, if you aren't the big boy. Well, a lot of things. If you've been listening, you may notice that your collective bargaining rights as a worker have been demolished, as things like working conditions and environmental protections have been tossed into a global race to the bottom. The nations of the world have been put into a position where they must all desperately bid against each other to bring the jobs these massive corporations have monopolized into their countries. And to do so, they will often have to accept little oversight of these corporations in exchange. This has naturally led to a myriad of problems, but that's not what this video is about. What this video is about is the consequences of this global concentration of wealth and power on a micro scale. How this affects the ability of every one of us to do the very things that make us human. Find an identity, build community, pursue self-fulfillment, and a sense of personal agency. The reality is that for most of us today, there's a defined path for survival. Take on a bunch of debt to go to college, get a job, and work until you retire, or die. In a globalized capitalist society, all of us must try our best to be rational economic actors. If your town doesn't have good educational opportunities, you need to move somewhere you can find some. No job opportunities? Move somewhere new. Now, I'm not saying this is inherently wrong. You may like living in big cities, traveling to new places, meeting new people, understanding new culture. If so, I hope you have the opportunity to do all of that. But this simply shouldn't be mandatory for survival. People shouldn't be forced to append their lives in the towns they grew up in, move to far-off places they don't know, to pursue educations they don't want, to work jobs they don't care about, simply to make ends meet. Ask people living in small-town USA. There aren't enough jobs there to sustain them anymore. This may sound to some of you like a natural evolution, survival of the fittest and all that, but it couldn't be more unnatural. Corporations like Tyson, Monsanto, Cargill, and others are squeezing rural America. Vertical integration has enabled these corporations to own all the inputs one needs to compete in the modern agricultural economy, things such as seeds, equipment, pesticides, etc. And simultaneously, these corporations are the buyers of all the outputs, such as crops, chicken, or beef. This allows them to charge you higher prices on the inputs and lowball you when they come to buy your yields during harvest season. That means less income left over for people who grow America's food to support themselves, send their children to get an education, and fund their local infrastructure and governments. It makes life untenable, not by some natural evolution, but rather a man-made funneling of resources from the pockets of those with the least into the pockets of those with the most. If you live in the suburbs or in cities, you're also a victim to this game of corporate squeezing. With massive control over large swaths of the economy, corporations have become the predominant employers in many areas across the country. If you live in the US, you've definitely seen franchises like Starbucks, McDonald's, Walmart, etc. that are as ubiquitous as they are identical. Since these companies are often the only sources of employment, and many unemployed workers need to compete for limited positions, this allows the companies to depress your wages to the lowest amount you'll take, or the least that they're required to pay. And if you try to start your own business, well, good luck. First of all, you're probably going to need real estate, in which case, you'll be competing against the multinational corporations which can take the profits they've made from global sales and bid up prices on the best locations in your local area. That's not just true of commercial property anymore either. That means the operating costs on real estate for small businesses are going up, even for entrepreneurs operating out of their own homes. But if you are somehow able to establish a physical location to operate your business, next you're going to have to deal with one-size-fits-all regulations. Now, I'm no anti-regulation conservative, but I can acknowledge that many small businesses are indeed disproportionately hurt by government regulations because many of them come with fixed costs. A $1,000 expense for a small business stings much more than that same expense for a billion-dollar corporation. Meanwhile, the corporations that these laws were actually meant to regulate are able to hire an army of high-powered lawyers and lobbyists to circumvent them. By applying one-size-fits-all regulations with fixed costs, additional strain is created for small entrepreneurs. And despite regulations being vitally important for a stable and equitable economy, this arrangement allows resentment for regulations among working-class people to grow, which capitalists then eventually exploit politically to gain reduced taxes and further deregulation of industry. But perhaps you've beaten the odds and managed to get your business up and running to provide needed goods and services to your community. That's when a Walmart opens up across the street and uses their massive economies of scale to sell goods and services at prices way below what you can as a small producer. And hell, even if they can't produce cheaper goods, they can engage in dumping, which means selling goods at artificially low prices to force competitors out, only to jack the prices up once they have a stranglehold on the market. Corporations like Walmart are able to do this because they have war chests of money that they can utilize from sales across the country and the globe. Your business will be long dead before the hit they're taking on the sales of an underpriced product in a localized market even makes a dent in their bottom line. And this is truly the thing that corporations do best: utilize their market power to insist that people adopt their products rather than their competitors. The outsized profits experienced by modern corporations don't come from making better products for less, but rather by making fewer, more expensive products that will eventually need replacing with newer, more expensive products. But hey, what's a little capitalist exploitation between friends? Especially once you consider all of the innovation that we get from it, right? Think again. Stemming from the outsized wealth and power corporations possess, they're positioned to take on risk in ways that normal people cannot. Imagine you're an engineer and you've come up with a genius invention that will revolutionize the tech sector. You can either quit your job, take on the massive task of building your own business in the face of the aforementioned odds, and hope that the whole not starving thing works out, or You can sell your patent to Google, Facebook, or Amazon for a quick $1 million. And keep in mind, the money you're being offered by these corporations can just as easily be turned around and spent on destroying you and your new fledgling company should you not accept their terms. For someone who may desperately need to provide for themselves or their family, a quick $1 million doesn't sound like a bad deal. That is, until a couple years later, and you see Zuckerberg is making $1 billion off your idea.
If I offered you $30 million for the company, would you take it?
Thus, corporations do not push innovation forward, but rather sabotage or annex innovation from competitors trying to break into the market in order to protect their own intellectual property. These companies are not bastions of innovation, they're parasitic growths getting fat on the labor and ingenuity of working-class Americans. But that's just how the private sector diminishes the agency and autonomy of everyday Americans. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few has also had major implications for the public arena as well. With the amount of money in politics these days, US government has become completely disconnected from the needs of its citizens. At a local level, small communities don't have the resources to compete against big money from out of town, which can easily flow in to tip the scales of state and local elections. And there's no way for any individual person to make an impact on the federal level, since you're only one vote among millions, and the need for large-scale resources becomes even more glaring. And this brings us all back to the everyday working people of America. Having been appended from their birthplaces to set out in search of work, many find themselves without a sense of community. For many people who were born and grew up in big cities, gentrification has brought them the same sense of displacement without having moved anywhere at all. They're no longer surrounded by friends or family from home, the people or places that they used to know. Add to that the shift to remote work since the COVID-19 pandemic, and people are more disconnected from one another than ever. Meanwhile, economic instability abounds. Student, medical, and credit card debt keep people with few options other than to keep working whatever job they can get. And prohibitively expensive housing, paired with rising interest rates and exorbitant rents, keep people from ever being able to settle in one place without taking on massive mortgages. And so, you can't start your own business because you can be easily outcompeted by massive corporations, and you can't petition your government for change because of corruption and outmatched resources. This leaves many of us feeling despondent and ineffectual, unable to realize our own dreams of self-actualization, even if we have the will to pursue it. And corporate culture has left us with towns and cities that are painted with their corporate homogeneity, totally devoid of tradition or identity. Wendover Productions did a great video that goes into further depth on this topic, link is down below. But look at these cookie-cutter homes, restaurants, and superstores and ask yourself, is this culture? Is this self-fulfillment? I can only speak for myself, but I don't believe this is what life was meant to be. Not only is it not what generations before us have known, but it doesn't need to be our future either. And don't mistake this for some nostalgic yearning for a bygone era, which certainly had problems of its own. Between emboldened Klansmen and polio, I'm all good on hopping in that time machine. No, rather, this is a desire for present-day society to reconnect with the elements of the past that have given humans our sense of community and purpose for generations. We can develop a world comprised of small and interconnected sustainable communities, even in a modern, globalized era. Now, if you're thinking, well, globalization can't be the solution, it's the problem. I will say that it is and it isn't. Globalization enabled the concentrations of wealth and power that we see at our present-day scale, but recall that this tendency toward concentration was happening back in the late 1800s. The tendency towards concentration isn't itself an inherent feature of globalization. That's capitalism you're thinking of. Globalization has amplified these problems, certainly, but it is not the source of them. After all, globalization has brought people, goods, services, and ideas from around the world together to enrich one another and create things that we may have never otherwise enjoyed. Like, do you want to live in a world without Tex-Mex or Rihanna? I didn't think so. So there must exist a middle ground, one that blends the advancements of the modern world with the sense of humanity of the old one. So where do we begin? Well, depending on who you are, you may be thinking, we just need to let the free market run its course like it did back when America was great. Then things will improve. Or perhaps you're thinking, Capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. This is its natural progression. The government must protect us from such evil. To that I say, will you both please stop shouting at me? Whichever side you fall on, I want to be clear about something. Capitalism and socialism are not boogeymen hiding inside your closet at night. They're simply different ways to arrange economic activity. The horrors of these systems come from the ways that they can enable our worst human impulses towards greed, conquest, and power. But disembodied voice! You just spent all this time railing against what corporations have done to the material conditions of the average American. Surely that's capitalism's fault. To which I say, yes, because here in America, we have capitalism. In Stalin's Soviet Union, all the power was centralized in the hands of the government, which then allowed the leaders of the Politburo to enrich themselves and their cronies, suppress the will of the people, and destroy material conditions for the average person. Does it sound familiar?
The Soviet system is actually incredibly unfair.
And it just sounds wonderful.
The only difference is in the US, we put that power into private hands, but the outcomes are the same. We have the same cookie-cutter housing, same cookie-cutter businesses, and same state TV. Except in America, they're brought to you by corporations. But what do all these examples of public and private tyranny over everyday people have in common? Hegemony, an established hierarchy of social dominance which snuffs out individual expression for cold, lifeless subservience to the ruling class. The same structures which have enriched and empowered the individuals at the top of our institutions are the same ones which keep the working person disempowered and disaffected. But if we want to create a world in which everyone has the economic freedom and personal agency to pursue their dreams, we must dismantle hegemony wherever it manifests. This would require sweeping structural change, which could take many different forms. I do not have all the answers for what a democratic and equitable future may look like, nor do I believe all the answers should come from any one individual. However, I'll posit a couple of structural changes that I'd personally like to see here, beginning with political changes that may create fertile grounds for a decentralized American society. My major suggestion would be that the United States should be broken down into a federation of collaborating states, more like the European Union. This isn't as weird as it may sound either, since Americans only developed a sense of national identity during the American Indian Wars and the War of 1812. Prior to that, the Founding Fathers were fiercely loyal to and identified themselves primarily by their states, not their nation. Many even threatened to have their states pursue independence, which is why the system of federalism, dividing responsibilities between the federal and state government, was developed in the first place. So the federal government could still exist, but not in its current form, which remains bloated from the imperialistic and industrial era that I've described earlier. Rather, the federal government would be reduced to more of an oversight and collaborative body, such as how the EU operates today. Duties the federal government could reprise include military coordination, regulation of interstate commerce, management of immigration and freedom of travel among the states, climate regulations, health regulations, and the establishment and enforcement of basic human rights. Essentially, the federal government would handle all the issues that transcend any single state. But what this would mean is that your state would become the primary authority for all day-to-day activities. They'd get to decide on most domestic affairs and collect most of the taxes. For reference, as of 2020, not a single one of the EU's top contributing member states, Germany, France, the UK, Italy, and Spain, contributed even a full single % of their GDP to the EU's budget. So now, if your state starts to act more like a nation, this means your county starts to act more like a state, and your town, a county. At every level of government, we'd see a transition of power away from the hands of a few elite political hubs and politicians into the hands of people who are closer to your daily life. Your state understands its needs, culture, and people better than the federal government. Your county and town understand them even more intimately. It is for this reason that counties and towns should receive more taxes and more policy jurisdiction. This form of governance would not only promote democracy and equitability, but justice too. In a federation model, the holdovers of American imperialism, such as Guam, the US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and even Hawaii, could theoretically have the agency to determine their participation in a new American system. Now, this would create disparities. There would be rich states and there would be poor states. There would be states that provide universal healthcare and those that would not. If it is the will of Americans, the federal government could help more or less to reduce these disparities, but they would still exist to some extent. However, these problems could be at least partially addressed by a restructuring of the private sector. So what would that look like? Well, if I had my druthers, a restructuring of the private sector would begin with large amounts of antitrust law breaking down corporations into smaller companies that can be divided across states. This would likely help reduce the anticipated disparities in wealth across a federation of states that I mentioned earlier. The wealth that is presently concentrated in places like New York or LA and other major business hubs would have to be divided along with their corporate entities across places like Des Moines, Boise, or Oklahoma City. In general, there would be fewer corporations. That's not to say they should be abolished entirely, but rather relegated to sectors that require interstate and/or international commerce. While I've mentioned that a hierarchical business structure poses issues to worker empowerment and the equitable distribution of wealth, it does make corporations more efficient at managing cross-border business administration. The corporations that do remain should have strong unions, funds which provide workers access to company shares, and labor representation on their boards of directors. Cooperatively owned businesses should become the standard for small to medium-sized enterprises, though not made mandatory. Small businesses that do not choose this path should still be required to engage in collective bargaining with their workers to work out wage and benefits packages that suit the individual context of these enterprises. By destroying the power imbalances and information asymmetries which the ruling class currently abuses in the private sector, workers and management should be able to come together as colleagues and peers to create terms that benefit all parties. Moreover, the empowerment of workers through unions, collective bargaining, collective ownership, and the breaking down of monopolies and oligopolies into many producers will lead to markets that are theoretically more efficient, create more jobs, and sell goods and services at more competitive prices. Without a concurrent restructuring of the private sector, a switch to a federation-style governance system such as I have already proposed would be unfair towards smaller and less wealthy states. In that case, wealth and influence would remain concentrated in states like Texas, New York, or California, resulting in political imbalances within the federation. But by pairing a decentralized public sector with a decentralized private sector, this model becomes both more feasible and equitable. And finally, if one is still unhappy with the policies and economic opportunities of their own home state, the right to freedom of movement would still enable people to move to the places that best suit them. But of course, the hope is that this will become less necessary than it is in our current system. Now, this has been a lot of theoretical brainstorming, but what would be the expected difference in the average American's lived experience? Well, first of all, when you pay your taxes, it would no longer go off to a faraway place to be embezzled by politicians or spent on bureaucracy and war. Most of it would go back into your state and local governments. Moreover, because of the reduced scale, elections held on the state, county, and municipality level would amplify the voice of citizens more than at the federal level. Suddenly, you aren't one vote among hundreds of millions in a choice between two bad candidates backed by billionaires in a rigged electoral system. Instead, you can be one vote among thousands, and the others around you are your neighbors, with no giant corporation from across the country putting its thumb on the scale. Organizing constituencies would be easier, leading to more robust public debate and more accountability for elected officials once in office. What you do begins to matter, both in the public and private realm. Businesses are owned and operated by people you know and care about, who want to do an honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Moreover, businesses become reflections of the people who live near you. When you visit the coast, the small businesses you encounter might be surf shops or fish markets. When you visit the mountains, small businesses may be artisanal woodworkers. It would not all be Best Buys and parking lots. Communities could instead take on their own local form and aesthetic. They would begin to reflect the geographies and peoples that occupy them. Real estate would not be driven by rampant housing speculators, and zoning regulations could be adjusted to fit local contexts, making housing abundant and affordable. Jobs would pay fair wages and offer dignity to workers through fair representation in management. You could have a voice in your workplace, and not simply have to follow the orders that are put in front of you all day. Work begins to have meaning again, as people begin to feel their contributions make a difference to the well-being of the company and their own livelihoods. No longer would citizens be limited to doing only what keeps them in a stable home with food to eat. we could see what America would be like if the potential of all of its citizens could be realized, if we no longer had to shrink ourselves to make room for our giant institutions. Now, this wouldn't be a silver bullet for all our issues. Racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and other forms of bigotry would persist. It's important to note that what I've argued for here is adjacent to a broader conservative argument for states' rights. However, I would be doing my listeners a disservice in not recognizing the legacy of the states' rights argument in upholding the very same oppressive structures that I am currently denouncing, such as the circumvention of federal desegregation mandates back in the 1950s. But a vision of America that is organized around a cellular structure of communities, counties, and states would diffuse wealth and power among the population. It won't fix everything, but it will at least diminish the systems of power and oppression which keep working class people under the thumb of the ruling class. It is my belief that liberating Americans from these structures may allow individual achievement, community engagement, and cultural expression to flourish once more. Globalization has indeed made the concentration of political and economic power worse than ever before. Mismanagement of our institutions by corrupt actors in DC or New York now has greater implications and affects more people than ever, both domestically and around the globe. This concentration of power makes the entire globe less stable, less equitable, less democratic, and less human. But globalization is not going away, and it doesn't need to. It has brought us many of the things that we cherish about the modern American melting pot. And so, if we're all going to live in a globalized world, then we must demand that it be a decentralized one.